There you go.
Hello, Ben. How are you this evening?
I'm well.
You hear me and see me okay?
Yeah, I can see and hear. Excellent. I can assume the same for me.
Great. Well, we only have 45 minutes to do this debate,
Yep,
so
let's back
if you
into
don't
it.
want to go ahead and get started.
Mhm.
I think to make this argument that Israel was founded by terrorism, we have to assess that there's no moral reason to justify that it isn't. So I'd like to go ahead and read what the definition of terrorism is to begin. Terrorism is defined as the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians in the pursuit of political aims. So, why would someone make such an accusation? We have to start at the very beginning. And that happened long before where this usually starts. Usually kind of starts in the middle. That's actually back in the 1800s. Theodore Herzl, I'm probably mispronouncing his last name, invented Zionism, a radical belief that Jewish people were entitled to a homeland, and he chose Palestine, probably because that's what it said in his religious text. But he actually had considered other places as well. So that would be the beginning. So they began migrating there. There were indigenous people there. Yes, they were a minority. They began migrating. They were under the Ottoman Empire, which of course fell to the British. So they began fighting the British, and they did that through terrorist attacks that are recognized as terrorism. And this continued until Britain and later the United Nations suggested, and that is the key word here, they suggested, they did not, they suggested that it be split into two states, one Arab and one Palestinian. And well, actually, I want to make sure that I don't forget to name some of the violent things that happened. Like the most notable thing that happened was the King David Hotel bombing, where the Irgun, they were a band of terrorists, and they are recognized as terrorists. The Israeli government has even recognized them as terrorists. They bombed this hotel, and the majority of the people who were hurt in this attack, they were civilians. They had nothing. They weren't even British. They weren't even Arab. Not all of them were Arab. Some of them were Jewish, and they blamed it on Egypt. And there's no way I can go over every attack that happened in 45 minutes, but this is the most notable attack that happened. And they try to blame it on Egypt. And that's also very important here, because that's kind of the point of these attacks is to bring in the larger power. So the British and League of Nations and the UN, they suggested that it be split into two states. And the United States, I just found this out today. I'm doing some more research over this. The United States actually didn't approve of this. I want to read a quote from that, because that's very interesting. I made sure I took a screen capture. I think this is because I didn't even know this till today. And the gentleman, he worked in the Truman administration. This is unfortunately it's a screen cap that I'm using here. But he says proposals for partition are a definite contravention to various principles laid down in the UN Charter, as well as to principles on which American concepts of government are based. These proposals, for instance, ignore such principles as self-determination and majority rule. They recognize the principle of a theocratic racial state, and even go so far in several instances as to discriminate on grounds in religion and race. Now, that in mind, I'm going to go ahead because this is a suggestion. Because I really want that has to be very clear here. The Balfour Declaration is only a suggestion of 2 states, and I want to go ahead and read to you the way that those states are defined, because I'm sure that you will counter argue. I will let you have a moment here in just a second. And this is from the Balfour Declaration. It says, "Her Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in that country." So they were only suggesting a state, and that was really on the condition that it ended this violence, and that obviously didn't happen. Of course, the war that happened, both sides blame each other like in every war, but the problem with partition is that it, of course, favored, I'm going to have to say the Jews here over the Palestinians, and they were upset about that, and the Palestinians lost that war, and they massacred villages. But even more importantly, the terrorist attacks didn't stop. And they were the same kind of attack that's known as a false flag, where they try to blame someone. So in 1956, they had the Suez Canal crisis, and this is just the most famous case. So there's so many cases, there's no way. I'm just using the most famous ones. And that's the Levant affair, where again, this is in 1956, this is after 1948. Again, they bombed and they blamed Egypt. They bombed the British and blamed Egypt, right? I think it was, they bombed, I think it was actually British and Americans. And they blamed Egypt. One more thing I should do is read the definition of Irgun terrorism. It's not the only band of terrorists, but and this is from Wikipedia. So that's not, which I know isn't the best source, but it's a very short article, and that's why I chose it. The Irgun, the national military organization in the land of Israel, was a Zionist paramilitary organization that operated in Mandate Palestine between 1931 and 1948. It was an offshoot of the older and larger Jewish paramilitary organization Haganah, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong. When the group broke from the Haganah, it became known as the Haganah Bet, B-E-T, which I can't pronounce. I can't speak Hebrew, so I'm not. Okay, so Irgun members were absorbed into the Israel Defense Forces at the start of the 1948 war. The Irgun is also referred to as Etzel, an acronym for the Hebrew initials. Okay, the Irgun policy was based on what was then called revisionist Zionism, founded by, I won't pronounce the name correctly, according to Howard. I can't pronounce this stuff. The policy of the new organization was based squarely on Javanist's teaching. Every Jew had the right to enter Palestine. Only active retaliation would deter the Arabs. Only Jewish armed force would ensure the Jewish state. The two operations for which the Irgun is best known is the King David Hotel bombing in Jerusalem and the Dur Yassin, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing this wrong, massacre, which they also carried out with the Lehi, another terrorist organization, in 1948. The Irgun has been viewed as a terrorist organization or organization which carried out terrorist acts. Specifically, the organization committed acts of terrorism and assassination against the British, whom it regarded as illegal occupiers. Does that sound familiar? And it was also violently anti-Arab. Does that sound familiar? According to Encyclopedia Britannica. In particular, the Irgun was described as a terrorist organization by the United Nations, British, and United States governments. In media such as the New York Times newspaper, as well as the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry, the 1946 Zionist Congress, and the Jewish Agency. Irgun's tactics appeal to a certain segment of the Jewish community that believe that any action taken in the case of the creation of a Jewish state was justified, including terrorism. The Irgun was a political predecessor to Israel's right-wing Herut, our Freedom Party, which I probably pronounced that wrong as well, which is the Likud party today. And of course, I should mention that the person involved in that King Hotel bombing became the first Likud prime minister. So tell me why this isn't terrorism, Ben.
Oh, all right. I think you've just missed the argument. It's not that terrorism didn't happen. It's that Israel isn't founded by terrorism. So, let's just recognize for a moment that lots of states, indeed, I think every state, had a lot of pretty terrible stuff happen in its history, right? Like as you defined it. Like, what is there? Violence and intimidation used against civilians for political aims. So every colonial country, for example, had that. You could point at the IRA and say that, if Ireland reunited, that would be founded by terrorism. You could look at America and say the same thing. And
so terrorism's okay then?
Hang on.
Terrorism's okay?
Mate, I gave you like 12 minutes. Let me finish. I never said that these acts are okay. What I said is that there's a clear difference in saying that in some states' histories, there was terrorist acts and saying that those states were founded by terrorism. So let me go through and address what you've said one by one, and hopefully I'll be able to clear this up. The first thing which you said is that Zionism is the radical belief that Jewish people are entitled to a homeland. So I think it might be worth exploring where this title came from for a moment. Zionism isn't Zionism, the term, originated basically when lots and lots of different groups had the radical belief that they deserved a home. So mainly how it happened was that lots and lots of nations in Europe, when they were formerly part of quite big nations, all decided that we want to have our own nation state, because it was actually kind of really close to the start when statehood first became a thing. The idea that other nations recognized you and you got sovereignty, like that. It's not an ancient term. Statehood and sovereignty is quite new. And when it started out, lots and lots and lots of different areas all wanted statehood. One particular group of people who wanted statehood was Jewish people, and their form of Jewish nationalism was called Zionism. So it's actually not all that radical, really. It's just like the idea that there's a group of people who all want a state, which is not dissimilar from basically any nation in Europe. The second thing which you talked about was your timeline, which I think is a bit disingenuous, if I'm going to be honest, was that, look, basically Zionism declared they did a bunch of terrorism until the Britain and US suggested that there was a partition. That's not the timeline. The timeline which you're looking for, which is the correct one, is that there was the declaration, that's Zionism, and they wanted a British state, so they wanted a Jewish state. So in the prelude to World War I, when the British was trying to secure up allies, right? That's when they did the Balfour Declaration. It wasn't just kind of like governments don't tend to make, public declarations as kind of like mild suggestions. That's dumb. What they were trying to do was shore up allies for World War I. And, since, that region of the world might have been useful to have the entire Jewish population as an ally, they made that declaration. Alongside a slew of other lots of declarations, by the way, like they promised similar lands to Mecca, they promised lands to all sorts of people. So it would have been seen in that context to be far more than just a suggestion. So then the next thing which happens is that the fall of the Ottoman Empire, British gains mandate over Palestine, and remigration happens back into of Jewish populations from Europe back into Jerusalem and Palestine. Now the important thing to note here is when the Ottoman Empire was around, there were Jews in Palestine, right? Like it's not an accident that the Jewish population happened to declare Jerusalem as the capital city. The reason for that is because they were 50% of the population in Jerusalem. They weren't 50, they were like they were a minority over Palestine overall, admittedly, but in Jerusalem. And you can look back, since then I've done a bunch of Googling and stuff, and there are well-known Arab artists who spoke Jewish and celebrated Jewish holidays when they grew up in Jerusalem, because there've always been a relatively even spread of Jews and Arabs living there. So it's not an accident they chose that place. They didn't have other places in mind. That's the place. So they started migrating back there, right? That's known as a diaspora, if you know that word. It's when you have a group of people who originate in one place and they spread around the world. So if you sound like you're American. So if there are any Australians living in America, they are part of the Australian diaspora, right? They come back, admittedly a generation later, but I don't see why that's relevant. And Jews basically start buying up lots and lots of territory. And this isn't terrorism, by the way. This is just buying land. So what they did is that they just bought land from Palestinian people willing to sell it, and then they started evicting Palestinian Arabs in particular from that land, because the idea is they wanted to have Jewish-controlled territory, which, unethical, admittedly, buying land and then evicting, based on race, but not terrorism. So then in reaction to this, the British kind of cottoned on to what was happening and ceased migration in the precipitations of World War II. Now, there's a reason why this halting of migration by Britain might have been seen as a hostile act. And clue here, because there was a particular fanatical leader who was promising to wipe out all Jews from Europe. So it was understandable that many of the Jews in Europe who were trying to move away from that conflict might have been a little bit more than annoyed that was happening. So in reaction, there is the King David hotel bombing. But importantly to note, that was not necessarily done as the founding act of Israel, or not even particularly involved with the official Zionist movement of the time. That was done, as you mentioned, by the Irgun movement, which is not the central Israeli organization. You even said Israel recognizes them as terrorists. Britain, the USA, the UN. All
that was later. That was not why. That was not when these attacks were going on, and they joined the military. And I said that as well.
You described them as an offshoot.
I'm not gonna let you lie, and you don't even have an argument yet, Ben.
Okay,
You're just appealing to hypocrisy in nature. Go on, though. Tell me why this is moral.
Because the reason this is relevant is that you wouldn't point at Malcolm X's movements and say that the Black Civil Rights Movement was founded by terrorism, just because one minority part of that movement happened to engage in terrorist acts, right? You wouldn't look at, for example, Colombian.
That's not an argument either.
Yes, it is an argument, because it's pointing to the fact that you have offshoot splinter groups all roughly the same aim. There is a central one which condemns the radical offshoot in the same way in which Martin Luther King would have condemned the terroristic actions of Malcolm X. You wouldn't say that Colombian paramilitary is a characteristic of all of Colombian independence fighters. So this isn't an appeal to hypocrisy. I think you've just misunderstood what that term means.
It is, because you're not telling me why it's moral, Ben.
Because that's not
it's an appeal
what the debate is.
The debate, telling me why it's moral.
The debate is not terrorism is moral. The debate is, was Israel founded by terrorism? So what you've got to show to me.
Yes, they were founded by terrorism. Okay, they attacked the British and the British said that's half okay, and then they killed then they started killing other people, and they kept doing it, and they kept blaming Egypt and all these other countries, and it's well documented, and even the United States and UN called it terrorism, and condemning what they did.
What I want to ask you then is why. I agree that the US and the United States called the Irgun movement terrorism. Why would they then recognize Israel? They're like, oh, these people, they're terrorists. Let's give them a state. No, that's not how those nations react, is it? Because we look at things like ISIS, and they actually use terrorism and state building almost as dichotomies. They say,
we recognize
it is a terrorist organization. So even, and I've even looked up where this conception came from. It came from a British documentary called The Act of Terror, where they call this the first terrorist attack in the world. Even that documentary recognizes that the Irgun movement was not representative of an otherwise quite ethical approach to creating an Israeli state, and that furthermore, the idea that that these countries would call this terrorism and then recognize it as a state is crazy, right? Like that, they obviously recognize a different group as a state. There's more than one Jewish,
The first country to recognize Israel as a state is the Soviet Union, and they believe that they were a terrorist. They believe that Israel was a terrorist state for 30 years after that. They were the first country to recognize them. And even if the United States or Britain, who were ever recognized, let me talk, Ben.
Yeah.
Even if they recognized it, they still condemned all their actions from that point. And in fact, President Eisenhower actually stopped giving money to Israel after the Levant affair. It was a big deal. It was on the cover of Time magazine. They had a lot of bad publicity about it. They didn't have this sort of popularity until the late 60s and early 70s. And the behavior continued because they acquired nuclear weapons. But Ben, you haven't told me anything. You've just told me that you basically said that two wrongs can make a right, or that because someone else does it, it's okay.
Okay,
you can give every example in the world. It's a circular argument. You're saying
this is not circular. Let me spell it out. Because if that's what you think the argument is, then I haven't done a good enough job clarifying it for you.
You have no argument. Are you telling me that appeal to nature now?
If you want to hear the argument, you've got to let me finish. The claim was never that terrorism is okay, or that every action created by the Israeli government is morally justified. The claim I am dealing with is the topic of the debate, that Israel was founded by terrorism. What I have pointed to is that there are several acts which constitute the founding of a state. That was the mass buying up of land and control of territory and recognition by other states. Neither of those two things are terrorism. What you have done is said, aha, I have found one radical offshoot over here which did a terrorist act and I don't think it's okay. Well, guess what, mate? I don't think it's okay either. But that was not the thing.
Was the Lavon affair terrorism?
Pardon?
Is the Lavon affair terrorism?
Explain the Lavon affair quickly.
Is the Lavon affair terrorism?
No, explain the Lavon affair quickly for me. Do you want me to Google
Okay, so 1956, this is after 1948, this is 1956.
Well after
during the Suez Canal crisis, they again attack America and Britain and blame it on Egypt, and they're caught red-handed.
Right, so this is well after.
So it's the state.
So this is well after.
This is after the founding of Israel. This is one of many attacks after.
Cool, so it's actually irrelevant because it's a decade after the state was founded. I'm talking about the founding of Israel. Right? Like, and what I would say here.
Okay, well, you can talk about it, but you still don't have an argument because you're just saying that because Americans did bad things and Australians did bad things or whoever, that doesn't mean that it's okay either. It just means that maybe America was founded by terrorism too, but that's a whole other discussion.
Now this is
quantifying the morality here.
No, this is interesting. So I never made the claim that it was okay. Like states can. Like, there's more than one non-okay thing, right? Like colonialism is not okay, and terrorism is not okay. That doesn't mean colonialism and terrorism are the same thing. So if you want to say that all states are founded by terrorism, right, which I think is where the only direction your claim can go in, that's a disaster. Like, can you imagine the geopolitical ramifications?
I didn't say that. You're saying that. That's your argument.
No.
That's your argument.
My argument is that the definition which you have set up as terrorism, i.e., if there is any part of your movement which offshoots and does a terrorist act, then the entire movement, it's found and becomes characterized.
I would know the definition is a definition. I read it from literally read the definition out of the dictionary and explained why these things fit that category.
No. You explained why. You explained why something that happened in the timeline was terrorism. You didn't then do the actual work of explaining why that thing was characteristic of the founding of the state, i.e., a radical offshoot movement doing something against the British, right? And the reason they did it is because the British held to migration. Does not mean that the founding of Israel was characterized by terrorism. The same way in which you wouldn't say Malcolm X, right? Because Malcolm X did some terrorist.
Well, actually,
you wouldn't say
the same way as someone else.
You wouldn't say that the Black Civil Rights Movement was founded on terrorism just because there was a radical offshoot in its conception. I mean, would you, out of interest? Like, that's a good question, I suppose.
That's another hypothetical appeal to hypocrisy. There's no reason for me to even entertain an argument.
You're not
telling me why it's moral. You don't have an argument. You're not telling me why it's moral.
Probably. Sorry. The way you.
Before we go on, I want to point out that I stated how the United States said this is a recipe for disaster by quoting that person in the Eisenhower administration, if you don't remember, and how they said that they don't like the partition and I think it's a.
I don't really count one bureaucrat in the Eisenhower administration said as making a comment as to what would lead to peace.
That's history, though, and you left that part out. You said that I hadn't brought that up, and I had.
No, I didn't say you hadn't brought it up. It's just like there would have been other bureaucrats who had a different opinion because they still recognized it as a state, didn't they? If everyone was of that opinion, then they probably wouldn't have been recognized as a state by the US. Can I just quickly address this appeal to hypocrisy thing? What you were calling as an appeal to hypocrisy is me asking you to have a principally consistent definition. What the appeal to hypocrisy argument actually is a subset of the ad hominem attack, where, for example, if you're a vegetarian, I would say, aha, some of the clothes you were wearing are, made from animal products, ha, ha, ha. That's the appeal to hypocrisy argument. Saying that your definition is inconsistent with others of your beliefs is not an attack on you, it's an attack on your argument and showing that it is horribly inconsistent. So you actually do need to engage with that hypothetical. It's not even a hypothetical.
You just said I have to answer your hypothetical questions. You're saying because of AAC, there's nothing in between the ground why this is moral. Just saying that because someone else did something that was immoral.
Where does the word moral appear?
Doesn't gratify it. And it's not at home because I'm not calling you a name. I'm not trying to discredit you.
No, I'm not saying you a name.
I'm just saying that you're not using a logical explanation. It's also called a U2 argument.
I didn't say that you were ad hominem this, and that's why I didn't say that you were ad hominem me. I'm saying you were accusing of me doing that to you. Now, you keep bringing up the word moral. Can I make this unequivocally clear for like the 5th time? State creation is messy and is pretty much never moral. That is why the word moral is not in the topic. What is in the word topic, if you read it, is that Israel is founded by terrorism. I could say they were founded by a civil war. I could say they were founded by an invasion. I could say they were founded by colonialism. All of those things would be immoral, and none of those things would be terrorism. Now, your reaction to this is to just conflate all immoral acts and then say all states are created by terrorism, in which case it ceases to be.
Even Ariel Sharon has said that it was terrorism.
You're talking
Even Ariel Sharon has said
act.
that, and to justify it.
You're talking about one act. You're talking about the bombing of the King David Hotel. Let me agree with you.
I said it was many acts, and there's no way I can list them all in 45 minutes.
How about this? Do you think that Israel would have been founded without the bombing of the King David Hotel?
I think many attacks would have continued to happen, like the United States said, and they needed to do something about it, but that maybe that wasn't the right idea.
Do you think if the King David Hotel hadn't happened, do you think Israel would be a state? So if you think that if the King David Hotel bombing didn't happen, do you think Israel would have still been a state?
Well, that's a loaded question, and I can't answer questions to
the reason it supports my argument is because you know the answer is yes. They still had large control of territory. They still had all the reasons for the other states to recognize them. So what it shows is that that act actually wasn't really the turning point in what makes Israel.
But it didn't help them because they got caught.
So what you're saying is that this act actually set Israel's statehood backwards, but somehow was still constituting of the founding of Israel. That's completely backwards. What you actually then said when it hurt is the idea that this bombing actually made it harder for Israel to become a state, but somehow you still think it's characteristic of the founding of Israel. That's completely asymmetrical. Like it can't hurt the statehood.
Well, I'm just trying to ground that they were terrorists. I'm just trying to ground that they were terrorists and that they got caught and they were caught. Do
you think that all Israelis were in on this?
It's, you know,
do you think that all of the Jewish people were in on this bombing, or was it just some?
Yeah, no, of course I don't think they're all in. That's ridiculous. That would be an ad hominem attack because they're trying to get me to blame people because of their race.
I'm confirming things you've already said, right? That this was a radical offshoot. It was a paramilitary group which wasn't even, which also was disendorsed by Israel, who also said that it was terrorism. And you want me to believe?
That was later, though. That was after they recognized the state, and they actually, even though they did punish people, they later recognized them and even created an award in their name.
I can tell you right now, the Zionists at the time, because it ruined put relationships with Britain back when they needed them to go well. And you still haven't told me why it is characteristic of the founding of the state of Israel, because that's the debate, right? And I could give you. Okay, how about this? How about this is another annoying hypothetical?
I'm just trying to say what they did that was considered terrorism, and I said that the British were concerned and trying to stop it. They were trying to stop the violence.
Say the Palestinians, as they are now, get a state, because currently they're not recognized by the US. Say like either Hamas or Fatah. I don't particularly mind. Okay, but say they're
not going to get one.
Well, I think it is demographic shift means inevitably they will, because the Israelis don't want their state to be subsumed with an Arab population. But that aside, say hypothetically they get given a state, they get given statehood. Would you say that state is founded by terrorism? Okay, so
yes,
yeah. So
because I two wrongs don't make a right.
The problem is that then you're stuck into this corner where every state is now founded by terrorism, which is like it's such a loose, broad definition. Well, most states did awful immoral things, but that's why the debate isn't statehood is immoral. The debate is that Israel was founded by terrorism.
I'm not saying every state was founded by terrorism. Like I said, that's your side of this because you're using this appeal to hypocrisy that you're trying to say, well, it's just, and I'm trying to say that's wrong.
Look up what a appeal to hypocrisy is. That's not what it is. As I explained earlier, it's when...
You want me to... Okay, we're going to do that right now, actually, because... Yeah. I think the audience needs to know what the problem with your.
I can explain
because that is
the appeal to hypocrisy,
and it's very clear.
The appeal to hypocrisy would be me pointing at you and saying, "Aha, you're part Jewish, so you're a hypocrite. Therefore, don't believe your character." It is a subset of ad hominem attacks. What I'm doing is I'm taking your logic to task, right? Because the logic of your argument is, if there was a part of the creation of something which was terroristic, that is characteristic of the whole of its creation. And every time you have not been able to give me like either why you would say that the Black rights movement is founded on terrorism,
because that's just be going down a rabbit hole. You're using a
this isn't
hypothetical argument
hypothetical.
there,
That
and
happened.
that's
The Black
so,
the Black civil rights movement happened. So it's not a hypothetical. It is just asking you to apply your definition to more than one context.
honestly, I use that same argument all the time because people might try to regard the Palestinians as like, say, Hamas, and Hamas is a terrorist organization, but they're not the Palestinian people. So I use the same argument.
Because I think the problem here is that one means terrorist
here.
organization is another means liberation movement. That's the problem. Every single time people fight for freedom, right? Like, let's look at the definition of terrorism you gave. That is the unlawful use of violence / intimidation against civilians for political aims. That is true. All right.
Okay, we'll do that as soon as I get to read what the definition of what I'm talking about. Okay, so appeal to hypocrisy, that's also the Latin term. The proper term is tu quo. And the fallacy of tu quo occurs in our reasoning if we conclude that someone's argument not to perform some act must be faulty because the arguer himself or herself has performed it. Similarly, when we point out that the arguer doesn't practice what he or she preaches, then suppose that there must be an error in the preaching for this reason. Then we are reasoning maliciously and
so as you see, I never accused you of not doing something. I never said, aha, you are a hypocrite because you don't follow, you don't do this in your life. What I'm doing is attacking the logic of your argument. I'm applying the definition you gave to more than one scenario and asking you, is the definition faulty or are you principally inconsistent? And at sometimes it's been one and at sometimes it's been the other, but that is not a appeal to hypocrisy as you've just read in the definition. That's just asking your argument.
Well, I have been consistent because I'm explaining why the United States said
Let's
that
be consistent.
They thought
do you think that the Black liberation, that the Black rights movement is founded on terrorism?
Honestly, I don't know enough about it.
Here's all you need to know.
Tell you. That's not an honest answer.
Did some terror stuff. Martin Luther King didn't, but they were both fighting for the same aim, which eventually came to fruition, which was that there was a civil rights movement in America where African Americans were given more rights. Since there was a large part of that movement which was not terroristic, and another part of the movement which was, which I guess to use your language would be a radical offshoot, do you think that the whole thing is then founded by terrorism? That's all you need to know. All right. So
I can answer questions to support your argument. I don't really see it. I see. The thing is, though, this is the reason why this isn't illogical. It's because you're not telling me the whole story here. You're just saying that because other people do it, it's okay. And morally, I don't think we can accept that this is okay. And if it's defined as terrorism, we need to call it terrorism and look at it that way.
You can call it.
And there's actually
you can call it other things which aren't okay. You know, like for example, if I said that like Australia or New Zealand was founded by colonialism, that doesn't mean it's okay because it's not terrorism. That just means it's another bad thing. I would say that Israel was founded on what's most probably described as a civil war. That doesn't mean that I love civil wars. That just means that I don't think they're terrorists. You know, like, seriously, could you imagine, like, your argument would be to say to the Palestinians, if you ever get a state one day, it will forever be viewed as being founded on terrorism. It's an awful thing to say. The Palestinians probably feel like they're fighting for their freedom. You know, and I get it, that fighting for your freedom, like, on the same...
Well, they do, but I think this is important. Maybe this is what needs to be pointed out here. The weapons that they used in that war were they acquired those weapons illegally that they used in the 1947-48 in that conflict. The weapons that they used were obtained illegally, so that would be under the definition of terrorism. That
illegally acquired weapons was never part of your definition of terrorism at the beginning. But if you're wanting to look at it now, that makes a lot of things not terrorism. Like, for example, if ISIS just buys guns legally from like somebody wishing to sell them, does that mean that the act they're creating is not terrorism anymore? That seems a bit bogus. Like, the method of acquiring weapons surely has absolutely no bearing on whether what it's doing.
Well, I mean, I'm saying that they're terrorists because they're operating outside of the law. But all civil wars, they're not operating within the law. That's why
it was the Arab
terrorism. That was the
Spring
definition that I gave. I don't know if you want to call that. I mean, these are
It's not a non sequitur.
that's a non sequitur. I can't
No,
even comment. I'm not. This
it's
isn't a debate about the Arab Spring. I mean, yeah, these things could be terrorism, but it doesn't. That's what's illogical
no.
about it. Just saying that
What
something
I'm
else is
pointing
terrorism
to is
doesn't mean that something
your
else
very
isn't.
glaringly obvious unwillingness to call other things which now fit your new definition terrorism. The problem is every time I point out something which makes this like any other act we wouldn't call terrorism, you gerrymander the definition to make it fit a little better, and then I point out that your new definition would call something else we all agree is not terrorism terrorism. You say, oh,
I've grounded it on the definition I gave you.
No. Seriously.
I mean, now you're just calling names.
Tell me if I've
misread
this. At the start of this debate, you, and I'll quote you, said that terrorism was the unlawful use of violence / intimidation against civilians for political aims. And then now, like later on, you've said, aha, it's got something to do with illegally acquired weapons. So,
well, yeah, if you're using violence, you need weapons. And
so you think that if the terrorists happen to just buy the weapons legally, it wouldn't be terrorism anymore? That's bizarre. Like, say I live in the US, buying guns is illegal. If I buy a legal gun and then shoot a whole lot of people up,
yeah, okay.
Yeah, but if I buy a gun legally and then shoot a whole lot of people up and shout, "I'm doing this for terroristic aims," does that mean that it's not terrorism anymore because I bought the gun legally?
That doesn't
exactly
mean
right. So it's got nothing to do with illegally bought
no matter what.
That's totally irrelevant. And this is my point, right? Either you have to classify basically all instances of state creation terrorism, at which point the word is functionally useless because it ceases to define anything which is unique from any other act. What terrorism is has actually usually got nothing to do with state creation. If you ask any person to rattle off the first three terrorist things off the top of their head, they'll probably say 9/11, they'd probably say the Paris attacks, and then depending on where you live, they might say, if you lived in America, the Boston Marathon bombing, or if you live in Australia, the Link Cafe shooting, right? None of those things have anything to do with state creation. None of those people are fighting for, Australia to become an Islamic state. They weren't fighting to take over America. They're just doing it, as you said, for political aims, to try and change the political behavior of a country in another region. The reason is, well, because it's entirely different.
What does that even have to do with it?
Right? Where the Igran movement, right, even if you want to consider them part of the Zionist movement, which I don't, by the way, I don't consider them to be part of the mainstream Zionist movement. Even if you did, they weren't doing that just to kind of, like harass Britain or harass Egypt. It's the same as the Palestinians. They're not like, fighting Israel for fun. They're doing it to try and create a state. That is a radically different sort of act to the act which most people would call terrorism, which, let's admit it, is things like 9/11, is things like the Paris attacks. 9/11 and the Paris attacks aren't, we want to take over France and America. It's just stop interfering in the Middle East. That's very different to what we're talking about, which is state creation, which is always bloody and always immoral, by the way. But it is because
our topic.
Okay.
I don't know. I understand what that's to do with the topic. I don't understand what that's to do with the topic, and I just don't feel like you're really grounding. I've clearly illustrated that the United States and other countries were upset about what we're doing, and they regarded it as terrorism, and that they wanted to stop it.
Then why did they recognize them as a state?
Sorry? They recognized them as a state because they were under political pressure to do so.
There was a lot of political pressure. No, that's how stupid that sounds. The reason which there would have been, I don't know. The idea that there was political pressure to support a group of people who are terrorists. I'll admit, this is what you said, okay, is that the terrorist action, the Igran group.
What do you want me to read? Do you want me to read to you about it? And I mean, explaining isn't arguing, but I mean, that's kind of on a loss here is that people they have a bias against what I'm saying.
I think that Trump just got elected. There are a lot of people who really hate Israel at the moment. They think that Zionism is the next devil. The people aren't biased against what you're saying. It's just what you're saying is not that Israel was founded of terrorism. What you've proved, okay? Let me tell you what you have proved definitively, and I agree, is that there was a radical offshoot movement called the Igran movement who did immoral things which we can call terrorism and that everyone agreed was terrorism.
You're just pulling one point out. You keep talking about one point and trying to get people to forget. You can roll the tape back. I had several points.
Okay, explain to me how that act, because that's the one the Suez Canal one is a decade after it was founded, so it's irrelevant. Explain to me how that act is.
Because I was trying to ground that the government, it was the government that they were still engaged in these acts of violence
the
for
point
political
is
reasons as a whole. So
yeah.
you were trying to say that it doesn't apply to as a
Okay,
whole,
right.
and
So
that
your
was the
proof of it
ground that it
applying to
does
it as a
apply as
whole
a
is
whole.
that a decade later, the Israeli government did something, which could be considered terrorism. I don't think that's sufficient grounding because the mainstream Zionist movement at the time was predominantly preoccupied with migration and buying up land. That's what they were doing, and you can look it up. That's how they got most of their territory. They just bought it. And
Even Ariel Sharon said that they wouldn't have had a state had they
I don't
not
believe
conducted
it.
these acts.
I
Ariel Sharon said that. He also said the Palestinian. He also said the Palestinians, what they were doing was
yes.
just
Right.
basically
So
the same
okay.
thing.
So I understand. So
That's
his
Ariel
political
Sharon.
motivation is to characterize the Palestinians as terrorists because it's like, oh yeah, they did some terrorism, we did some terrorism, so it's all fine. That's obviously politically motivated opinion. What I'm trying to explain is that, as you earlier in the debate even admitted, this act hurt the movement. So how can you possibly say it was part of the founding of the movement if it set it backwards? Look, we've only got 4 minutes, 3 minutes left, so I'm just going to quickly summarize what I think I've said, and you can summarize what you've said. What I've recognized is that what you've said is that there was a radical offshoot, to use your words. And I encourage people to rewind and listen to what you said. There was a radical offshoot who did a thing which was terrorism, and that's immoral. I agree. What I said was that that radical offshoot was not characteristic of the mainstream Zionist movement. It wasn't in line with what they were doing, and didn't have anything to do with the founding of the state. Furthermore, I even went on to say that that actually probably set statehood backwards because it started to alienate a lot of the necessary actors which were preconditions for statehoods, i.e. the British, the Americans, who you even said all didn't like it. So my summary position is this, that look, yes, a terrorist act happened. It didn't happen by the mainstream people trying to create an Israeli state and set it backwards. But furthermore, if you want to expand the definition of terrorism to include that, then that means that you have to say the Black Liberation Movement was founded by terrorism, that nearly all instances of state creation were founded by terrorism. And by that point, it ceases to be a useful definition and might as well just be called immoral stings, which I don't think is what people think of when they think of terrorism. They think of things like 9/11. They think of things like the Boston Marathon bombings, like the Paris attacks, which have nothing to do with the creation of statehood. So they deserve a different word. That word is terrorism. The Israeli situation is immoral. Yes, not terrorism, because there is more than one immoral thing than terrorism. Over to you.
Okay. Well, as I've defined terrorism, it is an act of violence for political gain. And Ben has tried to tell you over and over again how because someone else does it, it's okay. But that just means that they're terrorists. It doesn't mean that it's okay. And as if you roll back the tape, you will also see that I have cited several reasons several instances of terrorism, and that this attack on the King David Hotel, as I said many times, was just the most famous one. So I was just going to talk about the most famous one. They even attacked Jewish people, actually, and if you don't believe me, look it up. They were terrorists, and the person, as I said, the person who one of the people involved in that bombing even became prime minister. And just because there's other acts of terrorism, as Ben tried to explain, and another hypothetical argument, that doesn't mean that terrorism's okay, or that that there was no founding by terrorism. And as I stated, Ariel Sharon even cites these actions before the founding of Israel as terrorism. And also, as I said, it was only suggested that it be split into two states to solve the violence, which you can roll back the tape, and I said that as well. And Ben hasn't answered all these things. He's basically left out the reasoning that would get you to believe that it isn't terrorism by blaming someone else or appealing to nature, or trying to get you to have through emotional arguments and that sort of thing. So it's a circular argument here, folks. And as you notice, he kept asking me questions, trying to get me to respond, and he didn't really have any facts. I gave several facts. I just kind of tried to tell you tell you why it's okay anyway. And that's, you know, that's really the problem with this. I think that's why it's important to talk about it, is that just because someone else, that we all learn this on the playground, right? That just and acts violently